Hi everybody, welcome to the third office hours mini lesson. We're going to be going over a study that came out of the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. We're going to read through the article and take a few notes as we go. We're going to look at each of the measures that was used in the study to get an idea of what participants actually did. And then we're going to spend some time writing up this study to see, what should this write-up look like in one of your essays for class. So let's go ahead and dig in. All right, so here's the study we're going to be looking over. Long-term effects of institutional rearing, foster care, and brain activity on memory and executive functioning. The first thing I like to do when I'm taking notes is go ahead and write down that title and figure out how I would write my in-text citation. So if I go over to my notes here, I've written my title and I've figured out this in-text citation, Wait et al. 2019, and this is in the APA style. We can get a little bit of an idea from the title of what constructs they're looking at. They're interested in memory and executive functioning. So let's see how they define those constructs. Often you can find those definitions in the very beginning of the introduction. So as you can see here, they define executive functioning as an umbrella term for a group of skills involved in goal-directed action and problem solving. And then it goes on to list all these different skills involved. So when we talk about executive functioning, as they mention here, there are just so many skills that fall under executive function. So it's important that as we read through the study that we figure out exactly which of those skills were measured. Sometimes in the title, it'll say executive function, and then they'll just measure one or two of those skills. So you really want to know exactly what they're targeting. What are the constructs they're focusing in on? So that's something to keep in mind as we go through this paper. So as I mentioned, this study was interested in children who came out of the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. And you can see in this paragraph here, they talk about the project and the participant groups. And that's going to be something that we want to know about and want to write about in our essays. So this was a randomized controlled trial, and there were 3 participant groups. First was a group of children who were reared in a Romanian orphanage for their entire childhood. And this group is called the Care as Usual group. Another group of randomly selected children were placed into high quality foster care. And they were placed into foster care at different times, at different ages. And that was, they did keep track of that to see if when the child was placed into foster care influenced their outcomes later. But this group is called the foster care group. Later on in the paper, they sort of talk about these 2 groups combined and call them the ever institutionalized group. So these are children who spent any time in a Romanian orphanage during their childhood. And of course, then you have your control group, right? Your group of children who never spent any time in a Romanian orphanage and instead were reared in their family homes. So those are our 3 groups of participants. This paragraph talks about them for the most part, but also if I scroll down, they do have a little chart that tells us some more demographic information about the participants. It tells us the number of participants in each group. You can add those to get the total. That's something interesting to know. They'll talk about later in the paper how some of the groups were really, really small, especially when with this foster care group, if you broke it down by what age they moved from the orphanage to the foster care home, sometimes you'd only have a group of 5 or 6, maybe even 3 or 4 children in certain age groups. So getting an idea for what is the sample size is something interesting to talk about in your essay write-ups. All right, so my notes for that are right here. In this participants section, we have the ever institutionalized group, which is made up of the children who were reared in the orphanage, the children who were placed into foster care, and then the never institutionalized group. And you can see I got the ends, the sample size for each of those, and the total N was 161 children. And it talked about, and we'll see later in the graphs, that these children were assessed at age 8, 12, and 16. So now we've got an idea of who our participants are. Let's think about how they were assessed. We talked about working memory and executive function, but exactly how did the researchers look at working memory and executive function? And it looks here that they used a measure called the Cambridge Neuropsychological Test Automated Battery, otherwise known as the Cantab. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know about the Cantab right on top of my head. I've never taken the Cantab. I've never given the Cantab. I don't know what this is. So I have no idea what the participants actually sat down and did when they participated in this study. So often when you don't know what a measure looks like, you can look it up online and see a description, sometimes a video of what did the participants actually do when they sat down to do this study. So let's look up the Cantab. All right, so when I searched Cantab delayed match to sample, this is one of the websites that came up. You can see here they give you quite a bit of information about the measure. We'll go ahead and just take a look at what the measure actually looked like so we can get an idea of what participants were actually doing. So in this measure, they show you an image, and then they show you 4 others, and you have to select, which one matches exactly what you saw just earlier. There, that last one. Sometimes there's a delay though. So we'll show the image. They'll pause. And then they show you the bottom 4. So that's what this measure looked like. Delayed matching to sample. The next measure they used was stockings of Cambridge. So in this case, you are shown 2 images. You have your top stockings and your bottom stockings. And the participant can manipulate the balls down here, and the goal is to manipulate them so that the pattern down here will match the pattern up here. And the computer, of course, will count, how many moves you make and how long it takes you to make all of those moves. The next measure was spatial working memory. So they show you these different blocks, and behind each block, there's a little yellow token, or behind some of the blocks, there's a yellow token, and you have to fill up these squares over here, remembering which boxes you've already checked, which boxes were empty. Once you've finished one, it brings you to the next level where there will be more boxes and more tokens that you have to find. So it counts how many times do you make correct moves, choosing boxes that you haven't chosen before, and how many times you make errors again, and again, what level you get up to. And then finally, our 4th measure was the paired associates learning. In this case, you have a series of boxes, and they will randomly show you what's inside each of these boxes. Some of them are empty, and some of them have a pattern. So this one has a pattern, a little like green tea. And this one also has a pattern. After they've revealed what's inside each of the boxes, they'll put a pattern in the middle, and you have to select which box has that pattern. And again, select the box that has the pattern. So that's our 4 Cantab measures. So now that you have an idea of what the participants actually did in the study, what these measures look like, let's take a look at the corresponding results. So if you look at line graph A here, we're showing attention and short-term visual memory. On the y-axis, they show the percentage correct, and on the x-axis, they show the age groups. And of course, you want to see that the children are getting more correct over time, and that's the case for all 3 groups. However, you notice at age 8 that the never institutionalized group performs significantly better than the ever institutionalized groups. And this disparity persists as the children age. It doesn't get wider, it doesn't get smaller, it simply remains. The other thing that's interesting is there's really no difference between the foster care group and the children who remained in the orphanage. Those lines are pretty much right on top of each other. That says that, unfortunately, in this case, foster care didn't really help the children make any more developmental gains. And you see that same pattern here in line graph B, looking at spatial planning and problem solving. At age 8, the never institutionalized group is performing significantly better than the ever institutionalized groups, and that disparity persists over time. It does widen a little bit, but it doesn't widen so much that, that there's a significant difference in how much the disparity changed over time. You also see, unfortunately, that foster care really didn't have a beneficial effect. Let's look over at spatial working memory. In this case, the y-axis is total errors. So you want to see it going down instead of going up, which is the case for all three groups. But again, you see that at age 8, the never institutionalized group is performing significantly better than the ever institutionalized group, and that persists over time. Finally, looking at D, visual spatial memory and new learning, this was the strangest result from this study as far as I'm concerned. And definitely as the authors are writing about this result, they have a lot of speculation as to why it turned out this way. But at age 8, the foster care group performed significantly worse than the other two groups. And there was really no explanation of why that group performed much worse than the other two groups. However, if you look at the change over time, look at the slope of this line, it's much more steep than the other two groups. So yes, this group started off worse, but it also grew and improved over time such that by the end, there was really no statistical difference between the three groups. So they started off worse, but they also had the most improvement, that foster care group. And that's a finding that really kind of has a question mark over it. And while it's sometimes dissatisfying to read a paper and not have all of your questions answered, it can be looked at as a positive in some ways, in that it might potentially fuel future research to say, hey, there's still this question here. Let's see if we can dig even deeper and figure this out. So after taking some time to wrap my mind around the study results, I went ahead and wrote a few bullet point notes, just summarizing the results that we just discussed. So now I'm ready to go ahead and write a paragraph summarizing this study and trying to include as much of this background information as I can in that paragraph. And here it is. Wade et al. 2019 were interested in memory and executive function among children raised in Romanian orphanages, children placed in foster care from Romanian orphanages, and children who were never institutionalized, with a sample size of 161. The researchers assessed attention, short-term visual memory, so on and so forth, a bunch of executive functions at ages 8, 12, and 16. So these two sentences give the reader a sense of who are our researchers, when was this research published, what were the constructs of interest, who were our participants, how many were there, and at what time points were the participants assessed. They have all this background information now. So now the reader is able to take in those results and have some idea of how those results came about. So let's look at results. Results showed that children who spent any amount of time growing up in a Romanian orphanage fared worse on every measure over time compared to the never institutionalized children. Unfortunately, foster care had no ameliorative effect regardless of the age of placement. However, while foster care children showed the poorest performance at age 8 on visual spatial memory and new learning, they also showed the greatest gains over time in these areas, such that there was no statistical difference between participant groups by age 16. So you might notice here that I don't really have a conclusion sentence, right? That would be the perfect place to tie these results in with your overall topic of interest for your essay. So not only do you want to provide your readers with a really easy to understand summary of your study, but you also want to explicitly tie those results to the questions you were asking in your essay or the topic of interest of your essay. Finally, there's a few things I wanted to point out. I did not cover all of the results in this study. One thing that they looked into that I did not cover is they looked at, did it matter what age the child transferred from the Romanian orphanage to foster care? Did that in any way change how foster care benefited or not the child? Unfortunately, what they found in this study is it didn't really matter what age the child moved. In no case did foster care help the children as far as memory and executive function. I will say that this project has found other studies where if the child has moved to foster care before the age of 2, you saw significant beneficial effects from foster care. So there seems to be that critical period in certain cases and for certain constructs, but that was not the case, unfortunately, for memory and executive function. If you would like to know about some of these other studies that came out of the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, you can look it up on YouTube and see the actual researchers giving talks, talking to you about their results and being able to tie together results from a variety of studies that came out of the project. So feel free, please do, if this is at all interesting to you, give it, a search on YouTube, watch some videos, learn a little bit more about it. The other thing interesting on here is that the BBC put together a little blurb where they interviewed a gentleman who grew up in a Romanian orphanage as a child, and you can see his reflections of his experience, not only as he was in the orphanage as a child, but as he has grown up, how he feels it has influenced his life. Finally, the last result that I did not cover, they did assess the children's alpha waves using EEG and compared that to their Cantab results. I'm not going to be covering those results, but if you're at all interested in EEG, please go ahead, go back to the paper and look over that section. It's quite interesting. All right, everybody, thank you for joining me for this third office hours mini lesson. Next week, we're going to be looking at a paper by Bruce Ellis that talks about this idea of hidden talents, that children who grow up in adverse situations might actually adapt and acquire these hidden talents or new skills that children who didn't grow up in adverse environments perhaps don't take on. And let's see how that may help them later on in life. So I hope you have a great rest of your day and a wonderful week, and I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.